welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision-making as a parent of a demand-avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. Why is my child constantly destructive, controlling, and fixating on doing the thing that I tell them not to do, impulsively, reflexively, automatically? So if this is describing your PDA child or teen, you are in the right place. Today, we're going to talk about what's called equalizing behavior, and we're going to use lots of examples and talk about different types of equalizing so that you can better recognize it and identify it in your child or teen, or maybe even others in your life. Okay, so what are we going to do today? We are going to discuss 6 things. First, I'm going to define equalizing for you so that you have a good grasp on the concept. Then I'm going to talk briefly about when equalizing occurs and how to notice it. Third, I'm going to give you an invitation to experiment with the PDA lens for the next week. And then we are going to talk about the types of equalizing and then what to do about it very briefly. Okay, so the bulk of this conversation is going to be about breaking out the different types of equalizing so that you can understand with examples what's happening with your child or teen. Okay, so what is equalizing behavior? Let's start with that. So the definition that I use for pathological demand avoidance or pervasive drive for autonomy is the following: a survival drive for autonomy and equality that consistently overrides other survival instincts like toileting, hygiene, safety, eating, and or sleep. Okay, so what we know about PDA is that every time that part of the brain, that's a survival part of the brain, perceives on a subconscious level that there's a loss of freedom, choice, and autonomy, or that they are below you, a teacher, a scenario, a sibling, or even a board game, it will tell the nervous system that they are in danger or in life threat. So that causes physical and physiological changes in their nervous system, which we can't necessarily see. Sometimes we can look for indicators of it in, tension in their jaw or like the way the tone of their voice is, but often this is happening physiologically inside of them. So what we do see as parents or therapists or teachers is we see the behavioral expression of the disability, which is driven by a nervous system response. So equalizing is an automatic, reflexive, and nervous system driven behavioral response to cumulative nervous system activation and the perception of being below someone or something around them. And so it drives behavior, equalizing behavior, so that the PDA is above someone or something around them to balance out and get back to a place of nervous system safety. So this is why we call it equalizing, right? To equalize that neuroception around being below to being above, and then they can get back to equality. Okay, so this is an extraordinarily difficult type of behavior to experience on the receiving end, especially as a parent or a spouse or as a sibling or as a teacher or a therapist. So I know that this is a challenge to view it as something that is nervous system driven, not under their conscious control, not goal-oriented, and not something that can be treated behaviorally. So when we understand that it's a nervous system response, what logically flows from that is also the understanding that we can't treat like a trauma or a panic response with a behavioral driven approach. Okay, so when does equalizing happen? So Equalizing can happen in the moment when there is a neuroception or a subconscious perception around a loss of autonomy and equality. Or it can happen, and this is more confusing for parents, it can happen over time when there's an accumulation of nervous system activation, and then when they're around the safest, which is often the parent that spends the most amount of time with them, or the weakest person in the household. So that might be a sibling. But that can happen when there's not anything in the moment. Like, for example, if they spend all day at school, they're internalizing that threat response and they're complying and appearing pretty neurotypical, then they come home and they immediately start equalizing against the lead parent or the weakest in the household, which is a sibling. Okay, so it can be very confusing because this is also part of the pattern that is very common among PDAers, which is they're fine and appear typical in certain settings, and then they come home to unconditional love and safety, and you see lots of equalizing behavior, which is distressing. Okay, so the invitation today for all of you, whether this is brand new to you or if you're a seasoned veteran, is to experiment with a skill that I call the PDA lens, okay? So the PDA lens just means viewing this behavior through the lens of a nervous system response and not under the conscious control of the child. It's not a cry for attention. It's not manipulative. It's not goal-oriented, and it's not under their conscious control. It's coming from this part of the brain, which means we have to support it with this part of the brain rather than the rational part of their brain where they can think, learn, access empathy, and connect. Okay? So the experiment and the skill is to start putting on your PDA lenses when you see this behavior and experimenting with the idea that this is not under their conscious control. Okay, so let's talk about what does this look like in the home in real life with practical examples so that you can understand whether or not this applies to your child or teen. And for the purposes of clarity, I'm going to break these down into types of equalizing, and no need to memorize these or anything. It's just to give you clarity. And then we're going to give examples of each type. Okay, so we're going to start with controlling and fixation. We're then going to go to destructive or aggressive equalizing. Then we're going to talk about verbal equalizing. Then we're going to talk about oppositional equalizing. Then we're going to talk about equalizing towards self, which is often present when a PDAer is more internalized, so less defiant or outward fight-flight behavior and more towards self-internalizing. And then we're going to talk about adaptive equalizing. So how can this nervous system or reflexive response morph and evolve into something more adaptive and less aggressive and destructive towards others? So let's start with the controlling or the fixation. I'm going to give you some examples here. But in general, this could be correcting the words that you say. While you're playing with them, they're constantly telling you that you're doing it wrong, whether you're putting a little doll figure in the wrong place, or you're saying the wrong words, or you're, trying to be reciprocal when they're pretending to be a baby puppy and you're saying, what's your name, baby puppy? And they're like, stop talking. Okay. Or they say, I'm not a puppy. Just for a simple example, it can be criticism, and it can be all the way towards behaviors that can feel almost obsessive compulsive, like stopping you from eating, controlling when you can eat, controlling what you can eat, stopping you from going to the bathroom, deciding when you can go to the bathroom, etc. And the thing that we want to really focus on here is that equalizing behavior is directed towards the safest or the weakest person or towards self. So it's not just controlling behavior in a big picture sense, which might be associated with OCD. Okay, so let me give you an example from when my PDA son Cooper was young with reading books. Okay, so we would read 2 or 3 books every night because we were trying to instill good reading habits. And this was way before I understood he was PDA. And he would equalize, try and get back to that place of nervous system safety By controlling and changing the words of every book. Okay, so I would be reading the book and he'd say, no, 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 say it like this, or he'd change a word, and he needed to have that control in order to get back to a place of safety. But how it was experienced by me was just like everything I did was wrong, and he was controlling my words and I couldn't get through a book because he would just control and criticize throughout the entire thing. And I would have to make up new threads. And like when we would sing our songs at night, like for my son William, who's 5, I sing the same songs every night in the same way, and that's what he wants. But for my PDA son, he would need to change and have me sing in different ways every single night. And this was exhausting. So another example is with screens. So this is something that we just talked about in the Paradigm Shift program, where the parents were really concerned about screen addiction, right? Which is a very common and valid concern, right? Because their son was so fixated on the screen, like, because they had a screen time limit around how much he could have. So he would wake up first thing in the morning and he would want the screen. Then he would have his amount of time on the screen and fixate and sort of like control and constantly ask the parents, like in a disruptive and reflexive way, when am I going to get screen time? Can I have more screen time? But not like in a negotiation, in a reflexive way. So the question we asked ourselves yesterday on our live call was, yes, screen addiction is absolutely possible, but could this be equalizing behavior where the more we as parents have rules and times and amounts and control over the screen, which puts us in a position of authority and takes away the autonomy, the more they're going to be perceiving threat. And then what do they do behaviorally to get back to a place of safety? Try and control the situation around the screen. So it's just an invitation to see it through the PDA lens as like, actually what might be causing what looks like addictive behavior is the neuroception around not having autonomy and you being in an authority position so that they're fixated on the screen, right? So let me give you another example. Well, my son has been in occupational therapy for over 5 years, intensively in the beginning and, winding down now. And when he would have cumulative nervous system activation, meaning like a hard week at school where his brain would subconsciously perceive lots of losses of autonomy and equality, it would build in his system, right? And so when I was at OT with him, I'm always in the sessions, occupational therapy, I would know that there was cumulative nervous system activation and he would need to control me and the therapist. So we would throw out the agenda for that day and maybe he would sit in the hammock swing directing me and the occupational therapist to compete with each other and then correct how we were doing the game. Okay. So from an outside non-PDA perspective, this looks like a not productive occupational therapy session. However, if we look through that lens of the PDA, then what we can see is, he has cumulative nervous system activation in his cup. He's getting towards his threshold. And what can we do to bring it down? We allow the equalizing where he gets to have the control until he gets back to nervous system safety. Okay. So another example might be your child when they start to lose a game, whether it's a basketball game, whether it's a board game, you start to see the controlling, equalizing behavior where they need to change the rules of the game or they start saying that it needs to be done a different way, right? And it's almost like whack-a-mole because you adapt to their rules of the game and then if they're not winning, they change them again, right? So an example might be, this is an example from my life, playing Rummy Cube, which is like a game with numbers and patterns, right? So we have the rules of the game. We start out playing Rummy Cube with a grandparent. We put down our tiles and he's doing well at first. And then maybe Nana gets a couple tiles. And so he neurocepts, Nana's above me. Okay. So this is not conscious. It's just his brain being like, threat. So he reflexively starts to equalize and starts to invent a new rule so that he can put his tile down and maybe put a couple more so he's above Nana. And then if we correct him, like, oh, that's not the rule, then his brain, his neuroception, subconsciously perceives more threat and he equalizes more. So then he might start controlling more and changing more rules and insisting that he's not changing them, right? And it may escalate into the point of destruction, right? Like, and we're going to get to that where like he threw the rummy cube tiles. And this is all equalizing, but different types, okay? Then finally, I'm going to give another example of, again, my own son's equalizing. So recently, in the last 2 years, my husband and I have, as our family system became more of an equilibrium and more peaceful, we had started experimenting with going on dates for the first time in years on Friday nights, okay? So we had our au pair who lives with us. So there's a lot of nervous system trust there to stay with our son while we went locally to a restaurant. Okay, but our au pair would like start her work at 7 so that we could leave. And then he would ask for, like chips and pirate's booty. And her job was to deliver it to him, right? But right before we were leaving, he would always insist that I needed to do it. He wanted to control me because I was the safest, okay? So I could have looked at this from the perspective of like, it's my au pair's job. I'm going on a date. Like she can get the popcorn for him. But I understood that he was perceiving that he was below me because I'm deciding to leave. And he has the loss of autonomy of the safe nervous system leaving the house. And so what I can do as a parent is just say, okay, this is equalizing. This is subtle control over me. I can go get that for him and take an extra 5 to 10 minutes so that he gets back to nervous system safety and we can actually go on our date with regulated nervous systems, right? But I think for a lot of parents, we get into that mindset of like, no, like it's my time off. She can do it. Or like, I'm not going to give in to this behavior, but like paradoxically for the PDA, the fixation can become much stronger on doing the thing that you resist doing that they want you to do, or when we tell them not to do something. So like, for example, if we say, like, please don't touch this drawer, you might see a PDA child almost like as if there's like a magnet in their hand going towards the drawer. And like when you try and stop it, like you might even end up putting yourself between yourself and the drawer because it's escalating so much. It's almost like they're fighting to get to the drawer that you said they couldn't get into. And like from a non-PDA lens, we're thinking, what's in the drawer that they want so much? Why are they so focused on it? But with the PDA lens, what we can understand is, oh, there was a loss of autonomy, a limit. They don't get to choose about the drawer. So they're fixated on it like a moth to a flame, right? And then finally, one more example for the controlling and fixation type of equalizing is closed doors in a household, okay? So when my non-PDA younger son was like 1.5 and 2, I was a caregiver for both of them by myself and didn't have the ability to have another nervous system on my PDA, or well, I would put William down for a nap. And so I would try and close the door so that it was quiet and so that Cooper didn't come interrupt. But the closed door, his brain subconsciously perceived as life threat, right? So I didn't understand this at the time, but he would try and physically break down the door to get to us, right? And he would lay on his back and slam his feet, and it was adrenaline fueled. So even though he was only 5.5, it was extremely intense, right? And ultimately what I had to do was to realize the more I fixate on this limit, the more his brain is going to be through a survival drive trying to open that door. And so what we had to do was slow down the transition into the nap with the door open, which meant the PDA could like make noise and come in and out, etc. Okay, so let's move on to an even more challenging type of potentially equalizing, which is destructive or aggressive. So many of you have probably experienced this. So this might be small scale. Like you could say like, hey, Cooper, put your shoes on. And he's like, I'm not going to put my shoes on, or no, maybe he growls, stop talking. And you insist, like, you need to put your shoes on. So maybe he does that, but then he immediately equalizes to get back to safety by being above me and destroying something of mine. So he might walk by me in the kitchen, but knock all my books off, or take the spices that I'm cooking with and pour them out. Or if I maybe have like nice plants in the house, tear off the leaves of my plants. Okay. So this can also look like deconstructing objects of yours. It can look like breaking things of yours. It can look like physical aggression towards another, right? Poking, hovering, kicking, being in their physical space. So let me give you a simple example of equalizing that's more destructive. When my son, during Christmas time, I had asked my mother-in-law for a watch. It's not this watch. It's not my Fitbit. It is long gone because I wanted a nice watch. She bought it for me, and in a moment of activation, because there was a limit, he went over like 2 days after Christmas and slammed it onto the ground and it broke, right? So it can feel vindictive, but it's actually a nervous system response, okay? So then we have a couple more examples. So example of my son wanting to play with me, one-on-one attention, but I'm trying to eat my meal, right? But because I'm eating my meal, I have taken away that undivided attention that he needs. And I don't give him freedom and choice around my behavior, right? Or how he interacts with it. So he says, I want to play in the basement. I want to play in the basement. And I say, I'm going to finish my meal, right? So what happens? I continue finishing my meal, and then he goes immediately over to William, the weakest in the household, and he stands directly next to him and accidentally starts kicking him and knocking over what he's doing. But if you say something, there's denial even as you're watching it, right? And the more it escalates, the more it fixates on William, okay? So another example is more destructive, right? Coming into an occupational therapy session where there would be, things organized or laminated pictures for ideas. And the first thing he would do when he would get into the occupational therapy session for a couple years, also depending on how activated he was, would be to locate the thing that was organized and disorganize it or destroy it. Okay. So like these big puffy blocks that were always like, they were rainbow and always like in a nice orderly tower, he would immediately go to that and destroy like the organization and knock them down. Right. So he was perceiving he was below the situation, or maybe it was built up from school. And so he has to destroy or disorganize what was there to get back to a place of safety. Okay. So finally, I'm going to give an example of like maybe a teen or a tween where they're going to school all day, or maybe they're in burnout. So they have a lot of nervous system activation built up and they're near their threshold of tolerance. And so they come home from school, or they're at home from being burned out, and they are fixated and targeting their younger sibling. Maybe one's 12 and one's 9. And maybe there's even a couple other kids in the house, but there's like a fixation on the 9-year-old of like, you're stupid, criticizing them, calling them names, seemingly for no reason, because it's that like, and I'm not justifying it, I'm just explaining what's happening, which is they have neurocepted danger or life threat, and it's the behavioral expression of the disability to equalize against the safest or the weakest, okay? Now, let's talk about verbal equalizing. So verbal equalizing can be confusing because it seemingly recruits the social engagement system. And this is where parents often feel like, how can this be true? Like, how can this be a nervous system response if they're lying to me or if they're criticizing me for exactly my insecurity, or like they're not just destroying anything in the room. They're taking my favorite plant and taking the leaves off, or they're taking, my favorite coffee mug and like taking it from me and hiding it, right? So it seems like if this is just from the subconscious survival brain, how can it be so targeted, manipulative, and even lying? So my hypothesis is based on polyvagal theory is that it is possible, and there's research on this, to recruit the social engagement system in a nervous system state. But for the purposes of like your piece in your family and moving the needle, the experiment is viewing any type of this behavior as nervous system driven and then see what shifts. Okay. So let's start with more subtle forms of verbal equalizing. So let's say I'm trying to have a conversation with my husband, and there is a perceived loss of autonomy because I am shifting attention away. There might be constant interruption, like mama, 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 mama. Or I might be trying to have a conversation with my PDA son about like values in the household, or, I noticed that you were targeting William, and like, I noticed you go over and take his fort and take the blankets off, right? So sometimes the response might be, I didn't do that, or stop talking. But sometimes the equalizing might look like poop, 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 right? Like reducing meaningful speech to the point where you can't have the conversation. This is like a reflexive response where it doesn't stop, right? Like no matter what you say, it just keeps escalating. It can also be even more subtle where you're trying to have a conversation about like maybe a conversation you need to have because you notice that your teen potentially, like maybe you're monitoring their use of social media or Discord or Roblox, and you notice that they like created a new channel that you weren't able to monitor, or you saw some inappropriate behavior on Instagram or whatever it is that they use. And so you're trying to use your accommodations to like declarative language and like sort of bring up the topic so that you can have a conversation about this or do some collaborative problem solving. But every time you start talking about it, like, I noticed that you logged in from a different device, period, declarative language. Then they're like, oh, mom, I forgot to tell you that like I got an A on this project, right? And you're like, well, I really want to talk about social media. And they're like, I have to show you like what happened and the problem that I solved. And then I forgot to tell you that like my friend, remember me and Kathy were going to go to that tryout for whatever it is, and it's like this reflexive changing of subject. So you actually can't get to the topic at hand, right? And so for an older PDAer, if you have a tween or a teen or an adult, this can feel like whack-a-mole, right? You're trying to have a conversation. You're trying to get to the topic that you want to talk about, right? So this is like on a subconscious level, there is neuroception around, I don't have autonomy around how this conversation goes, or this person's putting themselves above me by setting the agenda of the conversation. Neuroception of life threat or danger or life threat, and then reflexive verbal equalizing. So it might be like you're trying to talk about a conversation that you want to have about a topic, or you're noticing something that they're struggling with. And it's like they take the thing adjacent to it. Like, I see that you're struggling with brushing your teeth. And they're like, oh, like I saw this advertisement about this really cool chocolate flavored toothpaste. And you're like, oh, let's get that for you. And then they're like, no, but like, I really think I need to check on my retainer. And you're like, okay, let's check on the retainer. I can call the orthodontist. And they're like, but I'm not sure. I actually forgot to tell you, ... right? So it's like you're honing in on the topic at hand to try and help them solve the problem or actually have a conversation. And it's like whack-a-mole to the next thing. And there's that avoidance within the conversation and the equalizing of changing the thread of conversation. So that's very subtle, right? There can also be lying, like when you said, hey, I saw that you destroyed your brother's things, or I see that you are hovering around him and like, when I'm not looking, you're kicking him in the side of his leg. And they reflexively say, I didn't do that, right? And you're like, no, but I saw it. And they're like, I didn't do that. And then they do it again, right? So this is like reflexive, nervous system driven. And in response to you correcting it, it's just escalating, okay? So now we're going to talk about oppositional equalizing. Think opposite. So think like you say not to do something, they fixate on doing the exact thing. And I know many of you have experienced this. So you tell a child not to touch something, they fixate on touching it, like almost like they can't stop touching it. Let me give you an example of riding the car with my 2 kids, especially if it's a long car drive and they're activated, or the PDA, who's 9, has cumulative nervous system activation. So riding home from school, it might be that Cooper is sitting in his bucket seat and he is sort of leaning into the space of William. And William is a sensitive, neurospicy kid himself. So he might be like, Cooper, stop, and push him over. And then Cooper will put both feet on his bucket seat, or he'll hover his feet 1 inch from the bucket seat. And then we will be like, hey, bud, like, can we just stick to our own seats? Like, do we need to stop the car? And it will almost be a fixation on breaking the spirit of whatever, quote, rule or limitation it is. So there's almost like a magnet towards getting his head or his hand or his leg into the space of William. And this often escalates to the point where we need to stop the car for safety, right? Like, I can't drive while you are fighting, while you are screaming. It's not safe for me. So that's a boundary. It's what I do in response. So let's talk about another one that you might see with an older PDA, or this could be a teen, this could be an adult. So maybe you have this brilliant PDAer who is very focused on social justice and environmental conservation, right? So like they're all about the environment and reuse and recycling and conservation and not doing overconsumption, and they're very passionate about that. But you want to talk to them like, hey, I'm thinking about buying an electric vehicle. And like you think, and you've heard them talk about like how great electric vehicles are. But for whatever reason, they start equalizing against you and talking about how bad environmental or bad electric vehicles are because of the mining, and is it really the right choice? And it's almost like befuddling being on the recipient end of this, because you know that their true feelings about something are one way, but as soon as you talk about something that's aligned, but it's under your decision making, then there is the reflexive equalizing to put themselves above you and control and criticize the situation. So we're getting into a lot of nuance here because, as we've said before, like equalizing doesn't necessarily stop as PDAers get older. It just looks different, okay? Finally, there was an example which was extremely traumatic for me, and this was like right around the time I started learning about PDA, which was the beginning of the pandemic. So I got really focused on him washing his hands, right? Because washing hands prevents disease. But the more I focused and tried to make him wash the hands, the more he refused to wash his hands. Not because of the washing the hands themselves, not because like it was a sensory thing. It was because of my pressure and agenda and putting myself in a position of authority to make him do it. And his subconscious brain was perceiving life threat around washing his hands, so he would avoid it. Okay, that's where we get the avoidance in pathological demand avoidance. But it's much more complex than avoiding demands. So let's talk about 2 more types of equalizing. And I think this is also getting into the nuance, which will be helpful in understanding your children, teens, and or yourself and those around you. So often, like if you have a teen, for example, or an internalized PDA, where maybe they were like the ways I've described, more defiant, oppositional, controlling, critical when they were younger, but it's increasingly become more internalized, you might see patterns of equalizing towards self. So what does that mean? Instead of having the nervous system reflexive behavior oriented towards the safest person or the weakest person in the household, what we might see is negative, controlling, critical, or aggressive behavior towards oneself. So this can look a lot of different ways. It can look like negative self-talk that's reflexive and constant. It can look like physical self-harm, like picking out eyebrows, picking out eyelashes, peeling back fingernails, cutting, headbanging, self-harm. It can look like destroying one's own things rather than another's things. And it can look maybe for a teen or an adult PDA like throughout the day, there's not a lot of control over the way that their day went. Like maybe you're a parent who is a PDA-er yourself. And all day you're experiencing losses of autonomy, quality because of the caregiving of your PDA child. So then, in order to equalize or exert control over the situation and be above it for a period of time to get back to nervous system safety, you stay up all night doing what you want to do, right? And this is a form of equalizing. So this is something you might see with a teen as well. So those are examples of equalizing towards self, which may be present if you have a PDA who is more internalized or who used to be externalized and then as they got older became more internalized. Okay, so this can feel very scary, especially when we talk about it as a nervous system disability, because the premise of a disability is that it's something you're born with and it doesn't go away, right? One thing I want to say is that PDA is a fluctuating disability, meaning when we can create a window of tolerance with a more accommodated self-aware lifestyle, then they may still experience the neuroception around threat, but not be at their threshold where they're constantly equalizing in a destructive way to everyone around them, right? Because we don't want that to be the nervous system response for their life, because especially their heart loves their safest person and their heart loves their sibling and their self loves the people around them, but their nervous system is driving this behavior. So we want to facilitate a life that isn't driven by fear and the threat response, but rather their heart and cognitive rational thinking. Okay, so there are ways that PDA kids already start to use this reflexive behavior in more adaptive, less destructive ways. So an example that I'm going to give from my son from his 3rd grade year of school was, maybe it was his 2nd grade year, where he would have math worksheets and he would always start in the middle of the worksheet rather than at the top of the worksheet, right? And the teachers knew he was PDA and he's in a very inclusive school, and they would, instead of being like, no, you have to start at the top, which is, quote, a rule and the right way to do it, they were curious and they were like, oh, Cooper, I noticed that you're always starting in the middle of the worksheet. And he had the self-awareness to say, yeah, my brain can't do it if I start at the top. So when I start in the middle, then I can complete the task, because he had control and could equalize against the loss of autonomy of the worksheet itself. Okay, so I believe this is adaptive, especially if you have people who are curious and flexible around you and aren't dogmatic of like, you have to start with the first question. But like, why? Why do you have to start with the first question? There's no actual reason. It's about the other person controlling you if they insist on that. Personally, that's how I believe it. And the cool thing that happened with this example was other kids were like, well, can I start in the middle of the worksheet? And the teacher was like, sure. And everybody got their work done. So often we have these cases where there is a fixation on controlling another, as a teacher controlling the classroom, or as a parent who needs to be in the position of authority, or, an occupational therapist who needs to get through the skills in their treatment plan that day, right? And when we can have more flexibility with these kids, but we double down on controlling them in situations where it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if you start in the middle of the worksheet, if you get it done. Like, who cares, right? I mean, some have maybe a logical flow, but this one didn't. And so I wanted to bring a cool example that I think is adaptive as well of an adult PDAer who shared with me that she always starts in the middle of the recipe. So she follows every single thing to a T, measures the things, makes sure she does all the tasks, but she has to do it in the order that she wants to do it rather than how it's written. And this is sort of a reflexive way for her to get through and like more of a rule-oriented thing. So the emphasis here is not on executive function, which means like I can't follow the instructions necessarily, or I'm not able to put them in an organized way, but rather like I am equalizing against this loss of autonomy in this moment so that I can do it. You might see things like your child wearing their shirt inside out and backwards, or underwear inside out and backwards. And so these small things can just be small reflexive things that they're doing in order to get their nervous system back to safety, which isn't destructive at all, right? But we correct them because we're worried, like, oh, if you wear your underwear backwards, you'll be uncomfortable, which is what I always think, but he's fine, right? So it's like, can we let them do these little things that get them back to a place of nervous system safety? So another way we can think about more adaptive equalizing is in the strong drive for social justice that a lot of PDAers have well into adulthood and from when they're young. It might feel like they think the rules don't apply to them, but the rules apply to everyone else. But if we can see it more positively, it might be they're defending a sibling against the rules of the household, or they're defending another kid at school from unjust rules, right? So another example from an adult PDAer is calling out systems and systemic change for equality. So when this individual gave birth to their child, they had a lot of negative experiences with the hospital they were at that could affect lots of other people. So they were driven to reach out to the head of the labor and delivery department, organize meetings, and do all of this advocacy with this energy of like needing to get back into safety, but in a way that was helping others. Okay, so we can think of how it can be adaptive or strengths-oriented down the line. At the same time, we're working as parents, teachers, therapists to accommodate these individuals so that they have a window of tolerance and aren't always past a threshold, which is what causes equalizing behavior. So, I know the thing that is probably on your mind most, if you're a parent listening to this, and I know if I was new to PDA, this would have been my question too, which is like, well, what do we do about it? What do you do about equalizing? So I teach skills and decision making, and I don't like to introduce like a million things all at once because then parents feel overwhelmed. So I like to focus on like, what can we experiment with over the next week and observe what shifts. So the invitation that I have for all of you listening or watching is, with this knowledge that we have of the idea that this is a nervous system driven response, it's not something they may even be consciously aware of, right? They may not understand why they're behaving in a fixated, controlling, critical way in the moment. They might not even realize they're doing it. So how can we find a way to select the moments where no one's in danger, physical, emotional, psychological, but you notice equalizing and your tendency is to correct it? The experiment is, can you just let it go without saying anything? And then see if that starts to shift some of the relational things, connection and trust between you and your PDAer. So that is our free training on equalizing. I hope it is helpful to you. All right, have a good day. Thanks everyone for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.